What's
Fantastic.
up, everybody? I'm so excited to be bringing in Sharon Kelly, a senior reporter from DSMOG. This is a very full circle moment for me because I had the pleasure of citing her work for one of my favorite papers I've ever written as a master's student, which was on neoliberalism and how its tactics influence international climate policy. So, Sharon, thank you so much for coming on today. If you could please introduce yourself, share a little bit about your career journey, and what you've witnessed in terms of environmental policies during your time at SMOG.
Fantastic. Thank you so
DSMOG.
much, Athena. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm so excited about the work that we've been sort of chatting about, and I really appreciate the chance to have these conversations. A little bit about me. I am an attorney by training, but I've been working as an investigative reporter for well over a decade at this point. As my career was getting started, that was also around the same time that the fracking and shale gas boom was just getting underway. And so sort of like throughout my career, that's been like a one of the many themes that I've covered sort of like with great interest is sort of like how like the economic and the environmental impacts from the shale gas and then shale oil boom sort of like have affected communities across the US, both, environmentally, economically, and then, sort of like, you have these global impacts, right, from the climate impacts of natural gas and fossil fuels. So that's been sort of like one of the major themes that I've covered in my career as a news reporter. DSMOG is like a nonprofit climate news organization. We sort of like have a focus on sort of like helping to clear some of the disinformation and misunderstandings and misinformation and around climate. So
Incredible. Well, it's such amazing work that you're doing. Before we get started, I'm sure we have some people here who are also interested in climate as well as journalism. So if you could talk a little bit about what it takes to be a climate journalist, what are some non-negotiable skills to make you stand out in this field, and which of them you would say maybe takes the longest to master?
This is a fascinating question. I might answer it by getting a little bit like sort of abstract, right? One of like the foundational skills that I think like really helps, whether you're doing climate journalism or just, as like a citizen in a democracy, right? Like for me, it takes the longest to master is sort of like getting a sense for how power operates. As a journalist, where that comes into play is it can help you like refine your instincts around like what claims might be misleading, or when is a company just talking their book, or when you're looking at areas where there's disconnects, right, that don't seem to make sense on first glance, right? Like I think like having an understanding of how power operates and like what people's interests are, like their financial interests, their political interests, like their ideological interests, like so much of climate reporting like centers on actions and interactions of like people in power, right? Like you're talking about corporations, regulators, grassroots groups, impacted communities who maybe didn't want to have anything to do with these issues, but just sort of like wound up in these situations. You have attorneys representing various interests. You have investors who maybe are, interested both in like economic returns and sometimes also interested in the impacts that the companies they invest in, are having more broadly. All of that can be really dizzying, right? If,
Right.
if if you don't keep your bearings, right? And I
Mhm.
think like having a sense for power that can really help to keep you grounded, right? Yeah, so I think that can really, if you're asking about the skills that really take a long time to master, that's the
Mhm.
goal of a lifetime, right? Like
Right.
that's something that nobody can ever say they've fully achieved,
Yes,
you know.
because it's such an overwhelming topic. And so thank you for talking a little bit about that. So one
Yeah.
of my first questions, this is with a little bit of background. Like I said, I was thrilled to write my final paper for my global environmental problems class on neoliberalism and private lobbying, or how private lobbying has affected international climate policies. So citing your article, I wrote, since the 2015 Paris Agreement, an estimated $1 billion has been invested to, quote, prevent climate change regulations while also running public relations campaigns aimed at maintaining public support for climate action by the five largest oil and gas companies. Kelly, um, this might be this might seem impossible for some people to understand if they haven't really read up on the topic. If you could please share a little bit more about your knowledge and journalism on how international climate policies like the Paris Agreement were and are still shaped by private lobbying on the local, state, or international level, that would be wonderful.
Fantastic. And I have to say, first off, I'm very honored that you read that report and found it useful. I want to sort of like give a hat tip of my own, which is, that article was based on that was my coverage of a report that came out from the climate research group Influence Map, right?
Mm,
And so Influence Map had done this research where they found this like this really fascinating disconnect between
mhm,
the ways that like, these five major oil and gas companies were talking about climate to policymakers versus the way that they're talking about it to the public, right? And what they found is that, you sort of had companies that were engaged in two things simultaneously. They're spending between 2015 and 2019, I think they spent like about $1 billion lobbying policymakers in ways that Influence Map found were like aimed at preventing climate action. And then at the same time, they're spending nearly the same amount of money on these public facing ad campaigns, where they're talking to the public and saying, we support climate action, right?
Mm.
And so, we went to the oil companies, we asked about this, right? And they sort of disputed the idea that they were in conflict with like the Paris Agreement. And to be fair, right? Like I think like anything that's, like touches on every aspect of our lives, right?
Mhm.
There's plenty of room to debate, how we should be addressing the climate crisis, what do we do about fossil fuels, right? And the impacts that they have, right? But I think like to sort of like use a microcosm to illustrate like the macro, I think what we've seen since has been pretty revealing in a lot of ways. One of the ad campaigns that Influence Map had sort of focused on was ExxonMobil's campaigns around their algae biofuels research, which they had made the center of this like major ad campaign in the 2010s, right?
Yes.
And actually, just in March last month, the
Oh.
Wall Street Journal ran an investigation where they had published some interviews and documents from ExxonMobil internally, right? That
Mm.
showed that inside the company, there
Mhm.
were significant doubts about the algae biofuels research program, right? This program was falling short of its goals. And ultimately, despite like, having spent like a very large sum of money promoting like this ad campaign centered on the algae biofuels. ExxonMobil ultimately like they abandoned that research program. That's one anecdote, right? Like that's one ad campaign, that's one research project, right? I think it kind of gives a sense for you can see how we've gotten to the point we've gotten to today, where we are also falling short of the goals that we had agreed on internationally and through the Paris Agreement, right? Like the goals of Paris limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. You've had UN officials come out and
Mhm.
say that those are, increasingly goals that are we're nowhere near on track, right? It raises questions not just about like ingenuousness, right?
Mhm.
But also, I think like that's why it's so important to keep an eye on where if there's a gap between actions and messaging, right? Like you gotta follow the actions, right? Because that's what's going to tell you what's happening in the what's going to happen in the future, right?
Yes, no, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I read a little bit about Exxon's algae campaign, but in the context of what they were thinking about doing with it, like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I actually didn't know anything about the research or the lack of confidence in their research about happening about a month ago. So that's news to me, and I guess to everyone here. So that's great. The next question I have is, while the articles I cited were from a while back in 2019, I came across another fascinating one you wrote just last year on how the fossil fuel industry wants to keep new buildings dependent on gas. How are they doing this? How successful were they? Because I'm sure you have to keep up on it. And what does this mean for net zero goals and efforts to shape green cities? And also, if you could please talk about what decarbonizing buildings entails and what its benefits are, that'd be awesome.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So again, this is actually this is also based on an influence map report.
Okay.
They did and this particular report centered on, it's really this fight over like what fuels are Americans going to use to heat their homes, right? And to some degree also cook with, right? Natural gas, as you know, and many listeners probably know, is it's primarily made of methane, right? Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. We've known for well over a decade, based on some really incredible research from Cornell scientists Anthony Ingraffia and Bob Howarth, that like natural gas can be worse for the climate than coal when you use it to burn when you burn it for electricity. If enough methane escapes or is released from like the natural gas infrastructure as it goes from like wellhead to to burner tip, right? To from where it comes from underground to the power plants that supply electricity, or to like your furnace in your home, right? The climate movement, I think, has sort of like supported efforts for consumers, right? For like, people who own homes or rent homes to electrify everything, right? So the idea is it takes a long time to replace everything that's like in your house, right? Your furnace is probably going to last like, 10, 20 years, right? So these are decisions that happen in slow motion in some ways. And so the approach I think has been from the climate movement has been to say consumers, all we're asking you to do is just choose electric, right? And if you choose electric, then environmental campaigners can push for utilities to move away from natural gas, right? And so it's sort of like this two-pronged approach, right? And so, to some degree, like that's actually turned out to be a pretty impressive strategy, right? What we've seen is like power generation is like, after seeing like a very dramatic shift away from coal to natural gas. Now you're seeing that the world is indeed shifting to renewable energy, right? I think just this week, the IEA reported that solar became the largest contributor to growth in the global energy supply for the first time, right? So that's, sort of despite a lot of like what's been happening at the federal level in terms of like policy. Nonetheless, you're seeing this energy transition continue to play out, right? But that's not the end of the story, right? Those economics aren't the end of the story. There's also this political fight, right? That's happening. And so, some years back, a lot of like states and localities, like cities, towns, counties, had begun to push for new development, like newly built houses, to include electrical power, right, and to not or furnaces to not use natural gas to fuel their homes, right, fuel new construction, right. That drew a significant pushback from the people who sell natural gas, right? And so I think that's a fight that whether you achieve the goal of electrify everything through, through bans or through state regulation or not, like I think, nonetheless, the momentum is still present in terms of like a shift towards electrification, right? And so I think there's a lot to be seen. There's still battles that are playing out. I think to some significant degree, like the industry has been like quite successful in blocking some of those like state and local regulations. But nonetheless, I think like you'd be hard pressed to argue that an energy transition is not still underway.
Definitely, definitely. As I'm currently writing a paper on energy poverty and energy efficiency, so that is also useful information for me. One of my
Fantastic.
last questions is, yeah, some companies like Exxon and these other ones that we've spoken about spend immense amount of money on lobbying against climate policy while also claiming social responsibility and perhaps donating towards some charitable causes and saying that they care for the environment, but like we said, they're lobbying against climate policy, right? So if you could talk a little bit about what's wrong with this framework and how can the companies address this hypocrisy, that would be wonderful.
It's really hard to talk about like the motivations of a company, right? Because a company is like it's a group of individuals, right? Like organized, like to generate profit, right? Like, individuals have complex like goals, right? And then a group of individuals has even more, sort of like complex goals, motivations, thoughts, etc., right? But I guess what I can say is some years back, I had done some reporting based on documents from I think from the Climate Investigation Center, where they had uncovered internal Mobile Foundation documents. And so the Mobile Foundation is the charitable arm of what at the time was Mobil Oil before it merged into ExxonMobil. And these were grant making documents where Mobil Oil or Mobil Foundation documented their decision making around these grants. And it was really, really illuminating, right? Because every single one of the Mobil Foundation's grants was written in a way internally to justify, why Mobil Oil should be spending that money, right? Because as corporate management, you have an obligation to your investors or shareholders. If you're going to spend money, right, you need to be able to say like, this is how it benefits them, right? And so I think like those documents were, to me, they were really revealing because I think like you do also run up against like the tax code, and I can't speak because like the documents that I was looking at were they were essentially historic documents at that point, right? Like they were older documents. It's difficult to say without speaking to whether or not like Mobil Oil or Mobil Foundation was following any laws, like U.S. tax laws around nonprofit organizations are, like you have to do things for charitable purposes, right? So there's tension between, the obligations of a corporation and the obligations of its foundation of a charitable foundation, right? Those are complex topics, and they're sort of above my pay grade in terms of figuring out how one navigates those tensions. But I will say I would quite recommend, especially in academia, a lot of like the grants that Mobile Foundation was considering were
Mhm.
for academics, right? And for universities. And so seeing how the company is internally talking about what its goals are from those grants can be I think really illuminating.
No, I think that that's really fascinating. I haven't heard anything about that particular study before, so I love learning a little bit about it. This is my last question. Just I'd love to know, or I'm sure the audience would love to know, some resources that we can turn to, any actions that we can take, and of course, please share any parting words.
If you're gonna give me a chance to talk my own book,
Absolutely anything. No, I absolutely please.
what I would say is, support climate journalism, right? Organizations like DSMOG are doing work that's aimed at like helping people see some of the things that, those facts that are out there or maybe aren't out there, but like, that help you understand the world better, right? And, I think like what we've seen since the elections has been a really sharp decline in the amount of journalism that's being done around climate. And so I think like organizations like DSMOG, which are continuing to like sort of like keep that spotlight on. If you find any of the things like that we've talked about like interesting, right? Like that only comes out because of the work that like journalists and editors are doing to sort of like shine those lights and help people better understand the world we live in, right? That's the goal. I know it's a lofty goal, but that's what we're hoping and trying to do. So.
Well, Sharon, thank you so much for your time and insight. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll see you all next time. Bye.